Welcome back to Reformed Thinking. Today we're getting into some really powerful material. We're going to be tracing the main storyline of the Old Testament. We're starting with Israel possessing the land.
Right.
And we'll follow that all the way through the return from exile. But the real focus, the main event for this deep dive, is the wisdom you find in one of the most difficult books in the Bible, the book of Job.
That's the mission, absolutely. And we're working from some great biblical theology sources here. One analysis in particular really helps us see how Israel's constant failure, really, to keep the covenant sets the stage for everything that follows. It creates this huge theological question, a question that Job just screams out loud. How does a sovereign, a just God rule a world that looks like this? A world so full of sin and suffering and what just seems like total chaos.
Right. So for you listening, what we're trying to do here is pull out these key ideas about God's absolute lordship. We want to get a real handle on the Davidic covenant and also see how suffering just forces you to have much more nuanced theology. It just throws out all the simple, easy answers. We're going to see how the history itself prepares you for the wisdom literature. Okay, so let's start with the history books kickoff, right after the Pentateuch. By the time we get to Joshua, Israel is a big nation. They're ready to see two of the three Abrahamic promises fulfilled, the promise of offspring and, of course, the land.
And that conquest under Joshua is so critical. It's the fulfillment of that land promise. This is the moment, that the people of God, the seed that was promised way back in Genesis, they finally have their inheritance. Everything looks like it's lined up. You'd think that this promised worldwide blessing is about to flow out from this place through these people to everyone.
But the sources we're looking at point out an immediate problem, a worm in the apple, so to speak. The forward momentum just seemed to grind to a halt almost as soon as the conquest is over. So what does the book of Judges show us about this immediate failure?
Judges is, it's a tragic story. It's this repeating cycle of failure to live by the covenant that God laid out. The real sickness at the heart of it is that they just refuse to submit to Yahweh's lordship. They don't want him as their true king.
They can't live under his rule.
They can't. So they fall into idolatry, disobedience. Then some external enemy comes and oppresses them. They cry out for help. And God, in his incredible mercy, sends a judge, a deliverer, to rescue them. But then the cycle just starts all over again.
It's like a national spiritual amnesia. They get rescued, they have peace for a while, they forget who rescued them, and then they're right back in rebellion.
That's a perfect way to put it. And the book itself tells you what the problem is. It's a line that's repeated, and it's pretty chilling. It says, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That one statement really defines the entire era. It just shows that the human heart, when it's left to its own devices, it will always pick self-rule over God's authority. It's the same failure as Adam, the same failure at Sinai, and now it's defining this whole period of the Judges.
Okay, so if self-rule is the problem, then the only solution has to be a true or righteous king. And even in all that darkness, the narrative gives us these little hints of hope that point toward that king. And this is why the sources really highlight the book of Ruth.
Yeah, Ruth is like the small candle burning in the darkest part of the Judges period. It focuses on these individuals, Ruth, Naomi, Boaz, who are still living godly lives even when the rest of the nation is in apostasy. But what's so amazing about it is the genealogy at the end. Ruth, who is a Moabite woman, is in the direct family line that leads to King David.
And that detail, her being a Moabite, that's a big deal, isn't it? Why is her being a foreigner such a theological bombshell?
It is, because it connects back to those really early hints that the king who would finally crush the serpent's head, the one from the line of Judah. Well, the plan was never for him to be some kind of insular, ethnically pure savior. Including Ruth shows that God's big plan, that worldwide blessing he promised to Abraham, is moving forward no matter what. It's not limited by our human expectations. God's grace is already reaching outside the immediate covenant people to bring about the line of the true king.
And this all sets the stage for the monarchy. Saul is the people's choice, their first shot at a human king. And our sources show his story just becomes a replay of the failures of Adam and Israel.
Saul is a complete tragedy. He starts out humble, he looks promising. But as soon as he gets power, his lack of faith is exposed. Instead of just trusting and obeying God's commands, he's constantly trying to rationalize his disobedience. He takes things into his own hands. He does things only the priests were allowed to do, trying to, guarantee victory with a ritual instead of just simple obedience. He's rejected as king because he wouldn't submit to Yahweh's kingship. He put his own judgment above God's clear word.
And then David shows up as this stark contrast, at least initially. He models that total trust that Saul just didn't have. The sources really present David's life, especially when he's suffering, as a kind of preview of the Messiah, this idea that suffering comes before glory.
That's a huge theme. In his early years, when Saul is hunting him, David literally puts his entire life and his future in God's hands. He refuses to kill Saul. He refuses to seize the throne by force. It's the living reality of what Hannah prayed about. God brings down the proud and he lifts up the humble. David's early life is the template for true dependent kingship. He's a standard for the future king who would perfectly live out that trust.
And yet, even after God establishes the Davidic covenant with him, which is the greatest possible affirmation of his kingship, David fails. Spectacularly.
And the covenant itself, you find it in 2 Samuel 7. It's an unconditional promise about the dynasty. David's house will reign forever. The king from his line is the one who will finally bring that worldwide blessing. But then David, right at the peak of his power, commits adultery and then murder to cover it up. So while the promise of the dynasty isn't taken aback, it becomes crystal clear that the blessing and the perfect righteousness, it's not going to come through David himself or through his flawed sons.
Then you get Solomon, the man of peace. He seems like the next great hope. He builds the temple. God's presence comes to dwell with the people. It looks like the goal of God's kingdom is being met. But just like his father, Solomon falls hard.
Solomon's reign starts with incredible wisdom, incredible splendor, but his political alliances with foreign nations lead him straight into idolatry as he gets older. He compromises the very holiness the temple was supposed to represent, and that catastrophic failure leads directly to the kingdom splitting in two, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. After that, the books of 1 and 2 Kings just show this relentless downward spiral into ruin. Even the few good kings in Judah can't stop the nation's slide.
So the whole story is just heading towards judgment. Assyria conquers the northern kingdom in 722 BC, and then Babylon destroys Jerusalem, takes the southern kingdom into exile in 586 BC. The promise of a kingdom seems totally dead.
The history really shows you the titanic strength of sin. It makes it obvious that the final victory over the serpent, the creation of a perfect kingdom on earth, it's not going to happen through human strength or human piety. The people are gone from the land, the king is gone, the promises seem so far away. But the story doesn't quite end there. Right at the very end of 2 Kings, there's this brief mention of Jehoiachin, the last king of Judah, being released from prison. It's this little literary clue, a hint that God hasn't completely given up on the Davidic line. Something supernatural has to happen next.
And that sets us up for the return from exile. The sources show God's sovereignty, even over these huge global empires, to make the return happen. We see this in Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther.
Yeah, Ezra and Nehemiah are all about the opposition they face, trying to rebuild the temple and the walls of Jerusalem. The enemies are seen as, the continuing offspring of the serpent, trying to stop God's plan. But the big theological point here is that Yahweh is king over the whole earth. He moves the hearts of pagan rulers, guys like Cyrus and Artaxerxes, to let the rebuilding happen. The lesson for the people coming back is clear. They have to purify themselves, follow the law, and understand their survival depends on obedience to God, not on their own political cleverness.
And then you have the book of Esther, which is so fascinating, because the name of God isn't mentioned even once, not a single time, yet it's this perfect showcase of God's sovereignty working behind the scenes.
It's a rescue story, and it's written to deliberately echo the deliverance from Pharaoh back in Egypt. Israel is at another low point, facing genocide from Haman in Persia. The book is teaching them a crucial lesson. God's deliverance of his people is never in doubt, even when he seems silent or completely absent. They have to wait for God to act while they stay faithful and obedient like Esther and Mordecai did. The Davidic king is still coming, and God is sovereignly protecting that line until he arrives.
So the big message from all these historical books is just this constant, loud failure of human beings to build God's kingdom. And that becomes the perfect context for the challenge that Job presents.
Exactly. If the human kings fail, if even the righteous nation ends up in exile, then what guarantee is there for God's justice in this life? That is the perfect setup for Job's crisis.
Okay, so if the historical books are all about the failure of the people and the need for a perfect king, then the wisdom literature, especially Job, asks the deepest question you can ask. What does life look like under God's rule when the whole reward system, which seems so basic to the covenant, just suddenly falls apart?
Job acts as this massive qualification, a huge caveat, to the general rules you find in the book of Proverbs. Proverbs often says, righteousness generally leads to a good life, and wickedness generally leads to ruin. It's the retribution principle in its most basic form. You reap what you sow. It's a general truth, a wise observation about how God usually orders things.
But Job just blows that comfortable idea to pieces.
It does. Job is living proof that the righteous are not exempt from suffering. In fact, sometimes they suffer in these agonizing, totally inexplicable ways that defy any easy answers. So true wisdom has to accept the radical complexity of living in a fallen world under a just God. It has to throw out those simple, one-size-fits-all answers about pain.
And the narrator sets Job up perfectly for this. He's introduced as blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. And he was incredibly rich, which made him the poster child for that proverbial idea. Righteousness equals prosperity.
And that detail is so important. It raises the stakes right away. To really get the theological weight of what happens next, you have to look beyond what's happening on earth. The prologue pulls back the curtain on this hidden reality, the heavenly council. This conversation between Yahweh and Satan, who is clearly the adversary, the serpent from Genesis 3, is essential. We, the readers, get information that Job never gets.
So Yahweh is basically boasting about Job's faithfulness, and Satan, the accuser, immediately tries to attack God's honor.
That's it, exactly. Satan claims Job's fear of God is just a business transaction. He says Job only serves God because God has protected him and made him rich. The argument is simple. Take away the gifts, and Job will curse God to his face. So God's own honor is on the line, and God gives Satan permission to test Job, first by taking his possessions and then by attacking his own body.
And when Job loses everything, his wealth, his servants, and worst of all 10 of his children, his initial response, it's just incredible.
It's the moment that proves God right. Job tears his robe, shaves his head, he falls down and he worships. He says, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." He acknowledges God's total sovereignty over everything, good and bad. And the narrator confirms, Job did not sin or charge God with doing anything wrong.
So this moment, which for Job is just pure anguish, actually brings glory to God. Because it proves the reality of his faith in front of this heavenly audience. Why is vindicating God's honor more central than Job's immediate comfort? What does that tell us about what's really at stake here?
It tells us the fight in Job isn't just some local argument about a prosperity gospel. It's a cosmic legal battle. If Satan could prove that all obedience is just self-interest, then God's entire reign would be called into question. The source material shows that sometimes God allows suffering in a righteous person's life, specifically to show the beauty and the genuineness of true faith, even when that faith has nothing left to gain on earth. Job's faith isn't about his circumstances, it's about God himself.
This is where the theology gets really tricky, though. This mystery of agency. You see Satan directly causing the evil, but the Lord is the one who gave permission. How do we talk about holding those two things together?
It's a point that needs careful handling, and we have to acknowledge that the tension is there on purpose in the text. On one hand, the evil, the desire to murder, to destroy, that comes from Satan, the malevolent one. But on the other hand, Yahweh is in complete sovereign control. He's the one who sets the limits, you can't take his life, and he's the one who gives the permission. The suffering happens because God willed it to happen for his own wise purposes.
And the narrator confirms this complicated relationship. It says Job was not wrong to attribute the suffering to God.
Exactly. The text says Job didn't sin in what he said about the Lord. And the epilogue later on talks about all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him. The key difference is in the purpose and the motive. Satan's motive was destruction and blasphemy. God's purpose was for Job's good and for his own glory. This paradox, that God sovereignly allows an evil act without being morally guilty of the evil intent behind it, is a deliberate mystery. It forces us to accept God's absolute rule over everything, even the chaos.
So the prologue establishes right away that the suffering isn't a punishment. It's for a redemptive and demonstrative purpose, even if Job has no clue why it's happening to him.
It establishes that God is just, that suffering can happen to righteous people, and that God has reasons that, while we can't understand them, clear him of any evil, and that sets the stage for the disastrous arguments of his friends. So most of the book is this long conversation that happens after Job's initial quiet submission just breaks under the sheer weight of his physical pain. His three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, show up with their simple, ready-made answers.
And Job kicks off the conversation with this cry of pure agony in chapter 3. He curses the day he was born. He just wants to not exist. And he insists over and over that his suffering isn't because of some terrible secret sin. He says, I have not denied the words of the Holy One, and he sees his pain as arrows of the Almighty.
Job's lament is a theological crisis. It's not just complaining. He's working with the assumption he was taught, that the just God of the covenant rewards the righteous in this life. And when that system fails so completely, he feels like God himself has abandoned him and is now attacking him.
And his friends arrive with only one tool in their toolbox, the retribution principle. Let's just define that clearly, because it's the engine driving all of their bad advice.
The retribution principle, as they understand it, is this idea that God works on an immediate one-to-one balancing act on earth. Good deeds always lead to good results. Bad deeds always lead to bad results, quickly and predictably. So, in their system, if Job is suffering this much, he must have committed some terrible sin. There is no other possible conclusion for them.
Eliphaz speaks first, and he seems to be relying on some kind of mystical experience, right?
Yeah, he starts his argument based on his personal observations and this terrifying vision he says he had. He states it like it's a fact of the universe. Those who sow evil will reap evil. He tries to be gentle at first, suggesting that God must be disciplining Job, not destroying him, and if he just repents, everything will be restored. He's basically implying Job is too proud to confess.
And Job just counters that Eliphaz has no idea what he's going through. He says their words are useless, like a dry riverbed to a thirsty traveler.
Then Bildad comes in, and he appeals to tradition and this very cold, unforgiving logic. He uses incredibly harsh language. He says God would never pervert justice. And his conclusion is just chilling. Job's children must have died because they sin. Bildad's faith is so rigid, so formulaic, he can't even imagine the possibility of innocent suffering. If Job repents, he says, God will make him prosperous again.
And Zophar, the third friend, he's the most aggressive of all of them.
Zophar is just outraged that Job keeps insisting he's innocent. He calls Job a liar, says he's arrogant. Zophar actually argues that Job must be getting less punishment than he really deserves. He insists Job can't possibly understand God's wisdom and demands that he confess right now.
Job, meanwhile, sort of gives up on his friends and starts directing his case straight to God. He argues that God is this incomprehensible, powerful creator who does great things beyond searching out.
Right. Job knows God is powerful, but he's using that power to critique what God is doing. He's arguing that God is so powerful, he could make an innocent man look guilty just by showing up. He's struggling not just with pain, but with this feeling that God is being arbitrary. He desperately wishes he had a mediator, someone to stand between him and God to argue his case.
Job starts to get more aggressive about his innocence, claiming there's no justice on earth because God destroys both the blameless and the wicked, and he lets wicked people rule the world.
And then he turns his anger back on his friends. He accuses them of defending God with lies. He calls them worthless physicians who whitewash with lies. Job would rather argue directly with the God who is hurting him than listen to the empty, cruel formulas his friends are offering.
And his most direct takedown of their whole theology is when he forces them to just look at the world around them in chapter 21.
This is a huge moment. Job asks them, why do the wicked live, reach old age, and grow mighty in power? He's saying, your formula is obviously false, just open your eyes. He points out that wicked people often get rich, they have safe homes, their families grow, and they die peacefully, all while they're openly shaking their fist at God. He uses real-world evidence to dismantle their tidy little theological box.
But then, just when it seems like he's about to fall into total despair, Job says one of the most famous lines of hope in the Old Testament. He suggests his vindication has to be in the future.
And this is the theological turning point in the dialogues. He says, I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God. Job is realizing that if he can't get justice in this life, then it must come after death. He's holding on to this hope of a living Redeemer, a vindicator who will make things right, even if Job himself dies first. This connects directly to what the epilogue hints at, that suffering isn't the end of the story for the righteous.
His friends can't answer him, so they just start repeating themselves. Eliphaz, in his last speech, just starts making up specific sins to accuse Job of, which shows they've totally run out of arguments.
Their failure to answer Job's point that the wicked prosper proves their whole system is bankrupt, and their silence is what allows this new character, Elihu, to speak up. His role is interesting. He's positioned between the failed wisdom of the friends and the arrival of God. Our sources say he's part right and part wrong.
So where does Elihu get it right?
He's right that Job made a mistake by trying to justify himself instead of justifying God. Job had become so focused on proving his own innocence that he started accusing God of being an enemy, a capricious tyrant. Elihu correctly points out that Job's focus on his own innocence led him to question God's justice, and Elihu also correctly sees the immense majesty and mystery of God's creation, which is a preview of God's own speech.
But he still falls into the same basic trap as the other friends, doesn't he?
He does. Elihu goes right back to the simple idea that Job's suffering must be a punishment for sin. He calls Job a scoffer and lumps him in with the wicked. So while Elihu gets a glimpse of God's greatness, he still tries to apply that same narrow formula of retribution to Job's life. He's a transitional figure, but still a flawed one.
So all of this, the history of failure, the breakdown of simple answers, the agony of the pain, it all builds to this final dramatic moment. And we finally get to the moment of divine intervention. God shows up out of a whirlwind and immediately rebukes Job. He says, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge?"
That rebuke needs to be read carefully. Job was right about the main thing. He wasn't suffering because of some horrible secret sin. But he was deeply wrong to think he had the insight or the right to judge God's actions and declare them unjust. God's first words are meant to humble Job's audacity.
And God doesn't give an explanation, does he? He gives a demonstration. His speech is just this long, relentless series of questions designed to show Job how small he is and how mysterious creation is.
God is basically saying, you want to understand how I rule the universe. Let's start with the world you can actually see. He asks Job if he was there at creation, if he helped lay the foundations of the earth, if he's the one who tells the sun to rise, or he knows the depths of the sea. God is showing Job that he barely understands the basic mechanics of the natural world, the weather, the stars, let alone the complexities of divine providence.
And the questions keep coming, focusing on wild nature, the mountain goats, the wild donkey, the war horse. Why does God focus so much on the wildness of creation, on things humans can't control?
The examples are meant to be humbling, almost sarcastic. Job, as a creature, didn't create the world, and he doesn't manage it. The untamed parts of nature, its unpredictability, its violence, reflect the chaos that's loose in the world. God is showing that the world has these elements of absurdity that mirror cosmic evil, and Job can't even control a wild donkey, much less the forces that govern the universe.
Then the Lord gets right to the heart of it. In chapter 40, he asks, "Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be in the right?"
That's the pivot point of the whole book. By demanding an answer and insisting on his own righteousness over God's justice, Job has, without realizing it, put himself in the judge's seat above God. So God challenges him. If you think you should be in charge, then do it. Go bring down the proud. Go get rid of evil. Of course, Job can't do that. Only God can.
And Job immediately caves. He says, "Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth." He admits he was talking about things he didn't understand. But God's not done yet. He escalates things by introducing these ultimate forces of chaos, Behemoth and Leviathan.
Behemoth comes first. People debate if it's a real animal, like a hippo, but the sources suggest it's more of a symbolic creature, this massive composite animal that represents the raw, untamed power of the animal world. It's too strong for Job to control. The point is that Job can't even tame the wildness that's inherent in creation.
And then Leviathan takes the whole conversation beyond the natural world entirely.
Leviathan is described in these supernatural mythological terms. It breathes fire and smoke. No human can even get near it, let alone defeat it. And it's explicitly called the king over all the sons of pride. This creature is the embodiment of cosmic evil, of demonic forces, of the primal chaos Job has been suffering under. God is showing Job his true enemy, the spiritual foe that goes all the way back to the struggle that started in Genesis 3.
And the sovereign answer becomes obvious. Job can't handle Leviathan, but God can.
That is the ultimate theological lesson. If Job can't even tame this creature, the symbol of primal evil, then he certainly can't tame God or force him to fit into human expectations of justice. God confirms that even the demonic, chaotic forces in the world are ultimately under his sovereign control and permission. Job may not understand how God uses evil for his purposes, but he has to acknowledge that God rules over it all.
So God's message isn't an explanation for Job's suffering. It's a declaration of his own capacity. He's the only one who can manage all the chaos and bring about righteousness in the end.
Yes. Job is being called to trust in God's infinite wisdom and goodness, and his true repentance follows right after. He confesses that he spoke of things he couldn't possibly comprehend. His repentance isn't for some sin that caused the suffering. It's for his intellectual arrogance in questioning God's providence. Job realizes that seeing God, enjoying his presence, that's what makes life worth living, not the absence of suffering. And the epilogue ties it all together by formally rejecting the friends' theology one last time. Yahweh says that Job's words were right and that his friends have not spoken rightly about me.
Which just reinforces the main point from the prologue. Job's suffering wasn't a punishment. It was part of God's wise but hidden purposes, which included refining and displaying Job's faith. The friends' mistake was trying to lock God's justice into their own little mechanical box.
And this brings us back to the definition of wisdom itself, which Job actually figured out long before God even shut up, back in chapter 28. Job says there that real wisdom isn't something humans can dig up through intelligence or observation, like a miner finding gold.
It has to be revealed by God. The conclusion of that whole section sums up the entire book's message. Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn away from evil is understanding.
The truly wise person is the one who submits totally to God's lordship, who stands in awe of him no matter what's happening. They keep obeying God even when they're in intense pain, and the reasons are complete mystery. Wisdom isn't comprehension, it's submission.
Finally, let's look at the future-oriented view the narrator gives us. Job gets everything back, doubled wealth, a new family. It's his earthly vindication.
It's important not to misunderstand that restoration, though. It's not a promise that every righteous person who suffers will get it all back on earth. If we say that, we're right back to the friends' bad theology. Instead, what the narrator is teaching is that it will be well with the righteous in the end. Suffering is never the last word.
And that perspective takes us all the way back to the cosmic storyline we started with, that struggle from Genesis 3.15. The final victory over the evil that Leviathan represents that requires a conquering king.
And that king wins in a very surprising way. Not through raw power, but through suffering. The perfect king defeats evil, death, and demons by willingly letting evil do its worst to him, and then conquering it through his resurrection. What sustains the righteous when they suffer, as Job finally learned, is resting in the relationship with a sovereign, just, and good God who has already defeated the very chaos he rules over. Hashtag outro.
That was a huge look at the historical failures of Israel and the intense wisdom challenge in the book of Job. I think the key takeaway for you listening is this. The book of Job just rejects any attempt to fit God's providence into our neat little formulas of reward and punishment in this life. He is sovereign and he is just, even when the reasons for our own personal suffering remain hidden from us.
Yeah, the sources really confirm the lesson from the whirlwind. God knows what he is doing. He rules over chaos, he rules over evil, and even Satan can't act without his permission. We're called to rest in the truth that God will make everything right in the end by fearing the Lord and obeying him, even when what we're going through makes no sense at all. We wait for the King who reigns over all.
We look forward to our next deep dive. Until then, keep digging into the truth.